Attention all grill masters and backyard barbecue enthusiasts. Lynn's has everything you need to make your 4th of July cookout a success. From sizzling certified Angus beef steaks and mouth-watering burgers to fresh-cut fruit and all the condiments you desire, we have you covered. Browse our weekly ad for celebratory savings like 39 cents per pound seedless watermelon through July 4th and shop online at lynsgrocery.com for extra convenience. Lynn's, where delicious begins.
History as it happens, October 10th, 2024. The new Middle East.
The Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades.
Several thousand Hamas gunmen broke out of Gaza and went on a killing and kidnapping rampage.
Large-scale Israeli strikes deep into Lebanon, including Beirut, have killed more than 2,000 people over the last year and 1,500 in just the past 2 weeks alone.
War is changing the Middle East, but maybe not in the way its participants believe. A new Middle East may emerge once the violence ends, but it may not be the Middle East the war makers dream of. We've seen this movie before. How to produce a better ending is next, as we report history as it happens. A podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The 3 principles of winning the war on terror are the 3 W's: winning, winning, and winning.
The survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands.
Those who carried out this attack, as well as anyone who wishes America harm, know this: we will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay.
Well, first and foremost, you see a resurgence of the Islamic State over the last couple of years that we've largely ignored. And that's not just in Syria, it's also in parts of Iraq. What's interesting is that I was against the initial war in Iraq and went and did research on the ground in Iraq in 2003, 2004, and then worked at the Center for American Progress for several years, where I co-authored and drafted reports that talked about the U.S. getting out of Iraq and the need to leave its troops by a date certain. What I realized by 2011, 2012, 2013 especially, is that it's not only trying to quote-unquote end wars, or these slogans that you often hear in our debates about ending endless wars, it's actually how you go about doing that.
Let's begin with a note to you, my listeners. This will be the last new episode of History as it happens, at least for now, until I can find a new home. After nearly 4 years at the Washington Times, the budget axe has fallen on this podcast of mine. I have no hard feelings or complaints. The news business is a business, and this is the business I've chosen. And the Washington Times has been a great place to produce thought-provoking and timely conversations about the origins of current events. I've already begun the process of finding a new company to produce History as it happens, and I'll let you know something as soon as I can, and I will let you know in my Substack newsletter. So please go to Substack and search for History as it happens and subscribe free. If you've been receiving my weekly newsletter via the Washington Times, that is going away after this week. So Substack will be the place to follow me from here on out. In the meantime, I will republish some of my best podcast episodes over the next couple of weeks, and I hope to have something new to say before the end of the year, because I feel today the way I felt when I launched History as it happens in January 2021. We need more historical thinking. Origins matter. In his address to the United Nations in September, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu repeated something he said a lot since October 7, 2023. Israel will defeat its enemies. It will change the Middle East.
Moses told us that our actions will determine whether we bequeath to future generations a blessing or a curse. And that is the choice we face today. The curse of Iran's unremitting aggression, or the blessing of a historic reconciliation between Arab and Jew. In the days that followed that speech, the blessing I spoke of came into sharper focus. A normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel seemed closer than ever. But then came the curse of October 7th.
As stunning as the Hamas atrocities were, the fact the Middle East is embroiled in another war really can't be very surprising given the modern history of the region. Not just the Arab-Israeli conflict, despite what White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said a week before October 7.
The Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades. Now, challenges remain. Iran's nuclear weapons program, the tensions between Israelis and Palestinians. But the amount of time that I have to spend on crisis and conflict in the Middle East today compared to any of my predecessors going back to 9/11 is significantly reduced.
Well, some historians have a different view of the region's recent history, and it is not one of quiet. For instance, Jay Menz, writing at EngelsbergIdeas.com, says October 7 manifested a hidden war that had been simmering for at least 5 years, pointing to problems in Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank, Iran, and inside Israel itself. But now that an all-out or full-scale war is underway or close to it, we're hearing those words again about a new Middle East. And it is not the first time Netanyahu promised that violence can solve the region's problems. Here he is testifying to Congress before the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003.
The application of power is the most important thing in winning the war on terrorism. If I had to say, what are the 3 principles of winning the war on terror? It's like, what are the 3 principles of real estate, the 3 L's, location, location, location? The 3 principles of winning the war on terror are the 3 W's, winning, winning, and winning. The more victories you amass, the easier the next victory becomes. The first victory in Afghanistan makes the second victory in Iraq that much easier. The second victory in Iraq will make the third victory that much easier too, but it may change the nature of achieving that victory.
A couple of years later, President Bush, at his second inaugural address, spoke of a new Middle East. A new world order, really, based on freedom that would emerge from America's global, violent crusade against terrorism.
There is only one force of history that can break the reign of hatred and resentment and expose the pretensions of tyrants and reward the hopes of the decent and tolerant, and that is the force of human freedom.
Has violence ever led to a better Middle East? I'm not asking that question rhetorically. Even when it comes to a war you might think was necessary, like Israel's preemptive war in 1967 against Arab countries that were ready to attack it. Did Israel's victories in 67 or 73 lead to an enduring peace with its neighbors? Well, maybe when it comes to Egypt, they finally made peace in 1978.
It provides for the full exercise of Egyptian sovereignty over the Sinai. It calls for the full withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Sinai. And after an interim withdrawal, which will be accomplished very quickly, the establishment of normal, peaceful relations between the 2 countries, including diplomatic relations.
Has it ever been possible to kill one's way out of a problem, say killing enough terrorists? You know, that question goes not only for the United States and Israel with their failed wars and occupations, it goes for Israel's enemies after 1948. Did PLO violence against Israel liberate Palestine? Hezbollah might claim it finally drove Israel out of southern Lebanon in 2000, but that hardly established peace between the two.
This is a message to the people of Lebanon. Do you remember when your country was called the Pearl of the Middle East? I do. So what happened to Lebanon? A gang of tyrants and terrorists destroyed it. That's what happened. Lebanon was once known for its tolerance, for its beauty. Today, it's a place of chaos, a place of war. Israel withdrew from Lebanon 25 years ago, but the country that actually conquered Lebanon is not Israel, it's Iran. You have an opportunity to save Lebanon before it falls into the abyss of a long war that will lead to destruction and suffering like we see in Gaza.
President Biden entered the White House seeking to rebalance U.S. foreign policy after decades of heavy-handedness in the region. The Middle East Institute's Brian Katulis writes, the administration's initial stance was to guard against the deep levels of engagement that had at times overwhelmed the broader agendas of the past 3 U.S. administrations. It expressed a general goal of right-sizing the U.S. military presence in the region Biden's overall message to the world in his first foreign policy speech as president, delivered at the State Department just weeks into office, was America is back. But here, too, the Middle East did not get much attention compared to other global concerns.
America is back. I speak today as President of the United States at the very start of my administration, and I'm sending a clear message to the world. America is back. The transatlantic alliance is back. And we are not looking backward. We are looking forward together. I know the past few years have strained and tested our transatlantic relationship. But the United States is determined to re-engage with Europe, to consult with you, to earn back our position of trusted leadership. Our partnerships have endured and grown through the years because they are rooted in the richness of our shared democratic values.
Well, now a year after the 10/7 atrocities committed by Hamas, the wholesale destruction of Gaza, and an escalating war in Lebanon, Katulis now writes, the United States is trapped in a reactive Middle East policy approach of its own making, 1 year into a regional war that continues to expand. This strategic drift in U.S. policy is a direct result of the Biden administration's wishful thinking and unwillingness to exert leverage through diplomacy backed by a coherent regional security approach. As a result, the United States has been unable to achieve nearly any of its stated diplomatic and security outcomes. I will share links to the full reports written by Brian Katulis for the Middle East Institute in my weekly newsletter. As mentioned earlier, follow me on Substack. Just search for History as It Happens. So maybe there are no good outcomes here. We can debate them for fun, but the U.S. record in the Middle East is one of disaster, our influence undercut by the depredations of the global war on terrorism.
The truth of our country's descent into torture is not precious, it is noxious, it is sordid. But it has also been attended by a bodyguard of lies.
I happened to catch a quote by William Safire from 1982 on Twitter as I was putting together this episode. He was writing about the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in '82. He said it might offer a chance for the rebirth of an independent, Western-oriented Lebanon. Again, the theme of this episode. How many times have we heard about the promise of war in the Middle East, bringing about a new, changed region? Yet the U.S. is expected to have to play some positive role if Israel and the Palestinians are ever to make peace, to name one problem. Brian Katulis is a senior fellow for U.S. foreign policy at the Middle East Institute. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on the program.
So maybe a good place to start, based on your work at the Middle East Institute, is where Jake Sullivan, a top Biden administration official, said the Middle East was going a little more than a year ago when he was speaking at the Atlantic Council Conference or whatever it was. Before 10/7, he said the Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades. Well, obviously, as the kids would say, that did not age well. Was it really quiet or was that an illusion?
Well, it was quiet, but underneath the surface, it wasn't. So on the surface, you had moves by Israel and Saudi Arabia to move towards a normalization accord. Last September 2023, the Biden team announced with many partners in the region at the G20 summit in India, this thing called the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. So they had all of these visions of regional integration and prosperity that essentially they were trying to lay into place, building on President Biden's trip to the Middle East in the summer of 2022. But like Mike Tyson, the boxer, once said, everyone has a plan, so you get punched in the face. And America got punched in the face. And that statement by Jake Sullivan was operating sort of at a surface level and was turning a blind eye a bit to all of the, not just Hamas, but the role that Iran plays in the region. And this is not a new thing for U.S. policy.
The Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades.
If you look at George W. Bush back in 2003, essentially speaking a few months into the war of Iraq, behind him was a banner that said mission accomplished. Or in 2006, in one of an earlier Israel invasion of Lebanon, Secretary of State then, Condoleezza Rice, said, this is the birth pangs of the new Middle East.
I have no interest in diplomacy for the sake of returning Lebanon and Israel to the status quo ante. I think it would be a mistake. What we're seeing here, in a sense, is the birth pangs of a new Middle East. And whatever we do, we have to be certain that we're pushing forward to the new Middle East, not going back to the old one.
So U.S. policymakers quite often mistake their hopes and visions for the future with the reality of the region. And I think the last year has told us what a grim and complicated reality that is.
You know, Sullivan did say there are still challenges. Iran, the Biden administration was supposed to, or at least it said it would, try to renew the nuclear pact with Iran. He also mentioned that there are still tensions between Israelis and Palestinians.
Now, challenges remain. Iran's nuclear weapons program, the tensions between Israelis and Palestinians. But the amount of time that I have to spend on crisis and conflict in the Middle East today compared to any of my predecessors going back to 9/11 is significantly reduced.
But, there's a difference, as you just said, between quiet and a resolution of problems. This past year has reminded us, arguably the most important fundamental issue to long-term stability in the Middle East is the one that has not been resolved since 1948, and that is the statelessness of the Palestinians, their lack of autonomy. They haven't been able to achieve their national aspirations. Do you agree with that? Am I overstating the importance of that cause to the other regional actors?
Yeah, that's one of two causes I would highlight that overarch and challenge U.S. policy and the stability of the region is the absence of a just settlement to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The second one I'd add to it is the role that Iran, particularly since 1979, has played in actually upsetting the balance and stability in the region. In 1979, an Islamic revolutionary regime came to power in Iran, and it changed fundamentally the lives of millions of Iranians, but it also changed the complexion of the region and pushed the United States to actually get more deeply involved. So those two things, the issue of Palestine and the issue of Iran, I think are the anchors that have troubled U.S. policy in the region for decades. And without any sort of discrimination against one president or another or one party or another, we've not really handled those two issues in an integrated fashion very well. And they're very much integrated. We could see it almost every day. But yet, certainly the question of Palestine, and I used to live and work in the West Bank and Gaza Strip back in the 1990s for several years on the ground there, and not having sort of a just settlement to that conflict has not only challenged Israel's security, but it also now roils the broader region, and we actually need a much more sort of steadier approach to achieve progress on that front than we've seen over the last several years.
Well, it was believed that the Palestinian issue was safely on the back burner. Israel and Saudi Arabia seemed to, at one point, be on the verge of a normalization agreement, even though the Palestinians were not going to have a state or anything like that. But about Iran, not that I'm a spokesman for that terrible regime, they would say the United States has been the chief destabilizer in the region since the start of the global war on terror. They would also point to U.S. support of Israel as being a destabilizing factor as the war is now widening into Lebanon and all. The Iranians would say, well, their proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, those are insurance policies because Iran feels besieged. It's been under these maximum pressure campaigns of a hostile West, and also hostility within the region itself, trying to crush Iran or affect regime change in Iran.
Yeah, that's certainly a view. It's also a view that I think is mostly at the upper echelons of a totalitarian Islamic regime. And I think there's some danger in just echoing that propaganda because it actually ignores the reality of what the Iranian people, first and foremost, are suffering from. Second, I think if you look at what the U.S. does, not only with Israel, but a lot of its Arab partners who want us to engage. And it's not just our military approach, which has had some flaws, some big ones, including the Iraq War in 2003 and how that was mishandled. But when you measure that up against Iran actually investing in a number of terror groups, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, a series of militias in Iraq and Syria, that presence actually serves in the region to actually undermine the stability for ordinary people across the region. And it's often not acknowledged. And I think the new dimension that becomes a challenge to actually figure out how to engage with Iran, and I believe we need to engage with Iran no matter who's leading it, is the fact that it's not just a threat to global or regional stability. It's now increasingly challenging European allies and others who want to see an end to the war in Ukraine. It's a war that began with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and now the Islamic revolutionary regime in Tehran is offering ballistic missiles and drones to Russia in its war against Ukraine. So it's not just a regional dimension. You got a pretty long rap sheet against the current government in Iran. It doesn't care for the rights of its own people. It destabilizes the region, much more so, I would argue, than the United States and its presence does. And then lastly, it undercuts global security. And I think that's been a challenge both for the Biden administration, the Trump administration, the Obama administration before them, to actually figure out what's a holistic approach that deals with the fact that Iran is, under its current leaders, more of a force for instability than stabilizing the broader Middle East.
Yeah, I would agree that the U.S. will have to deal with Iran directly. It's not going anywhere. As Ronald Reagan once said, the Islamic Revolution or the Iranian Revolution is a fact of life.
The Iranian Revolution is a fact of history. But between American and Iranian basic national interests, there need be no permanent conflict.
And Hezbollah is not going anywhere either. It may have started as a small militia in the early 1980s to resist the Israeli occupation, but today it's a state within a state. I also want to return to that problem with you a little bit. What to do about these groups that are hostile to U.S. interests and Israeli interests in a very uncompromising way. But when it comes to Iraq, for instance, because you brought this up about Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, the U.S. invasion to topple Saddam Hussein is what made Iran the most influential country in Iraq, right? We toppled the secular Sunni counterbalance to the Shia militants in Tehran. And the U.S. worked with these militias to attack ISIS. After sidelining ISIS, if you will, or driving ISIS underground, these militias turned their weapons on the U.S. presence there. So why should the United States, even if everything you're saying about Iran is true, and I agree they are a destabilizing and nefarious actor in the region, but why should the United States still have troops in Iraq who can be shot at by these militias?
Well, first and foremost, you see a resurgence of the Islamic State over the last couple of years that we've largely ignored. And that's not just in Syria, it's also in parts of Iraq. What's interesting is that I was against the initial war in Iraq and went and did research on the ground in Iraq in 2003, 2004, and then worked at the Center for American Progress for several years, where I co-authored and drafted reports that talked about the U.S. getting out of Iraq and the need to leave its troops. And this was 20 years ago by a date certain. What I realized by 2011, 2012, 2013 especially, is that it's not only trying to, quote unquote, end wars or these slogans that you often hear in our debates about ending endless wars. It's actually how you go about doing that. And when we left in such a way, and I think we've seen this militarization of U.S. foreign policy over the last 20 years, especially since 9/11. But if you don't have a diplomatic and strategic approach that lifts up those in places like Iraq that want to work with us, who don't actually want to depend on Iranian-backed militias for their security, what happened when Obama pulled out was ISIS then emerged shortly thereafter, right? And then Obama had his Michael Corleone moment using the character from Godfather and Godfather 3. He said, just when I thought I was out, we were pulled back in. So that was 10 years ago, and we're still actually facing a continued challenge from the threat of ISIS. So I used to be one of those voices that is a bit more ostrich-like, that wishes away or tries to say that the U.S. presence is not actually helping with challenges like ISIS. I understand that, but I actually think that's not the reality of today's Middle East. And if we ignore the continued challenges, which my colleague at MEI, Charles Lister, you should have him on to talk about this, has written about the real risks of simply pulling up stakes, which it seems like the trajectory we're on in Iraq. And then it's easy to predict that we'll likely be back because some of these threats will not stay where they're at. And it's probably better to have a more balanced approach, as Charles and others argue, that essentially isn't like our presence in Iraq for 10 or 15 years from 2003 to 2018 or so, but a little bit more modest there as well as in Syria. Because if you simply operate with the assumption that a U.S. presence does more harm than good, I think you're missing the reality of like the history of the last 30, 40 years. The sort of chaos that you've seen bubble up, particularly in places like Iraq in that 2011 to 2013 period, you're likely to see more of that emerge without that support the United States provides to partners in Iraq and Syria, I would say.
Doesn't the U.S. military presence catalyze resistance?
It does a little bit, but I think if you do the full net assessment, it actually does a lot more to stabilize not just the region, but how the region serves as this bridge between Asia, Europe, and other places. So if the U.S. presence as some have argued, and I heard these arguments. I made some of them 15, 20 years ago. I, in retrospect, realized that it's actually incorrect, because if the U.S. sort of pulls back, and this dream that if the U.S. pulls back from the region, we use our leverage of support to Israel to somehow end the occupation, we re-enter the JCPOA with Iran, there'll be an equilibrium and balance achieved. And there's a lot you got to ignore to actually come up with that conclusion. And increasingly, like, I respect those views, but I think it's mostly driven by what I've written as neo-Orientalism, people who are projecting our own political and social debates here at home on a much more complicated reality in the Middle East. And what it mostly ignores is the vast majority of people in the Middle East who don't appreciate and like the fact that the Houthis in Yemen, if you're Yemeni or Lebanese, who resist and don't like Hezbollah, or my friends who I used to work with in Gaza, who hate what Hamas has done to its own people, let alone the most recent war. You know, I get why people express those views. I don't think it's grounded in the reality of the region as I've seen it over the last 25, 30 years.
Well, you know, this all raises another issue, though, the unintended consequences of trying to fix things. And why does this region continue to be so important that, you know, we would have to keep troops in Iraq 20 years later? I don't want to say, well, so what if there's a group like ISIS or the Houthis? But I am kind of saying, so what? What level of instability or threat to U.S. interests can the U.S. live with if it's really impossible to eliminate these groups through the use of military force, which I think has been proven over the past 2 decades?
I don't think we're capable. Recent history shows us that we're capable of actually living with that, because those threats actually don't stay at home for a couple of reasons. One, when ISIS emerged back in 2013, 2014, and beheaded a handful of journalists and Western aid development workers, it galvanized the American public towards Obama's re-engagement in the Middle East. Now, what I think was missing in that re-engagement, it was, again, heavily militarized. It didn't do much to actually work with our partners who were in the anti-ISIL coalition to produce not just what we need to do to eliminate threats, but I think the biggest thing that we need to focus on is what can be built in the aftermath. And even though that anti-ISIL coalition, which still exists and had 5 lines of effort that included helping provide assistance, and not the U.S. taxpayer assistance, but getting the region and others to pay for that, to stabilize the region. It's the same sort of vision that whenever this god-awful war between Israel and Hamas ends in Gaza, it's not like U.S. taxpayers nor Israelis are going to be the ones who are footing the bill for that. You actually have to work with a deeper engagement in the Middle East and in the region with our partners rather than pull back. And again, this is the case where I think for the last 20, 30 years, because so much of our approach has been militarized, we often miss the opportunity to figure out how to get our partners to pull their weight and pay their fair share for stabilizing the region. So it's not just eliminating these terror groups, it's creating the conditions for people of Gaza, for people in Lebanon when this war is over too, to actually have a different governments and leaders that actually respond to the needs of their people, which is not what we have in Tehran right now. It's certainly not what we have in Beirut, and not what the people of Gaza have had for the last 15, 20 years.
Well, hasn't U.S. influence waned? I mean, you say in your report here, a report for the Middle East Institute, actors in the region will continue to be the main drivers of events. You say the U.S. remains the most important external actor in the Middle East, but it would be a mistake to overstate how much it can shape and influence events there. The Biden administration's inability, you say, to achieve its goals, including the immediate objectives of a ceasefire and hostage release in the Israel-Gaza situation, demonstrates the limits of U.S. power and influence.
Yeah, that's coming from Strategic Drift, a report that we released earlier this month. If you look at the recommendations and also what we should do about that, because I think that's an accurate picture, I think a key part of the answer is deeper engagement in the Middle East, especially diplomatically, not pulling back. Because again, part of the arguments, and I used to make these arguments, of pulling back and saying, well, we should just pivot to Asia or come home, doesn't recognize the fact that there are many other countries in the region that actually are trying to do more to assert their self-interests. And because the U.S. is one of the primary actors, much more so than Russia, China, or Europe, that can shape and guide, we actually need to work more closely with the Jordans, the Egypts, the Gulf Arab states that are actually trying to serve as a bridge for stability in the Middle East. And in many ways, going back to those 2 big ticket items, a state of Palestine and actually a different type of Iran that doesn't threaten its neighbors. That's a key center of gravity that actually has a lot more influence than the United States does unilaterally. And what I'm essentially saying is the right formula is not pullback. It's actually trying to organize more of a posse or a team effort that involves mostly deeper diplomatic engagement and says, look, if we want a long-standing solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, we've got to work with our partners to achieve that. If we want not war with Iran, but an Iran that is on the track towards greater regional integration and is not a threat to its neighbors, you actually have to listen to some of these Arab Gulf states, many of whom we don't like, that just met with Iran's leader the last few days and essentially have said, we don't want there to be a wider Israel-Iran war. And that's an interesting dynamic that I think U.S. diplomats have not yet seized upon. And then our discourse back here, whether it's the restrainers, so-called restrainers who are more neo-isolationist, or so-called progressives who say we should pull back, they don't realize the opportunity for emphasizing even deeper diplomacy in the United States, from the United States, to actually achieve some of the same ends that a lot of people want, which is a state of Palestine and Iran that doesn't actually upset the order of the region.
I agree with you wholeheartedly when it comes to diplomacy. My problem is that U.S. prestige and influence has been frittered away because of our military misadventures. You have said here that some of the countries in the region want the U.S. to be involved, but not militarily. They want soft power. Is that what you're saying?
No, that's what I used to say, and I realized that that's naive. And it's naive because it ignores the reality that in April, when Iran sent 300 ballistic missiles and drones towards Israel, but it also threatened a number of countries, the U.S. military presence, not China's, not those in the region themselves, though they played an important role, not Europe, not Russia, the U.S. military presence actually prevented even worse outcomes. And what you need is diplomacy backed by a very balanced use of security presence and very limited use of force. And I think the pipe dream that I used to live in, and this is sort of, people had this post 9/11, I was critical of the global war on terror, which I still am, is that you actually need diplomacy backed by a sense of security and calm. Those actions in April actually gave us a lot more credibility with some of our partners in the Middle East and the people of the Middle East who don't want missiles raining down on their head. I mean, the bitter irony in the latest salvo of Iranian missiles against Israel is that the only person that was killed, as far as I could tell from the news, was a Palestinian worker in Jericho, right? And the U.S. military presence and this fiction, which I think it's easy, like in think tanks and in the media in Washington, D.C., to engage in what I've called this neo-Orientalism of, well, if we just simply, our military presence is evil and it causes more harm somehow than Iran. I mean, it's laughable when you hear those arguments from the perspective of people in the region who live there and recognize that we don't want hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops in the region, but we do want the sort of support that they provided in April that prevented even worse outcomes than could have happened, and I hope won't happen before Biden leaves office, and a direct war between Israel and Iran.
What about the issue of the U.S. weapons pipeline to Israel? This has been a major criticism of the Biden administration. Israel has used these weapons to destroy Gaza, now waging war in Lebanon, to try, this is the stated goal, try to drive the Hezbollah strong points away from the border so some 60,000 Israelis can return to their homes. I guess my question is, what role does the U.S. weapons pipeline to Israel play in all of this?
Well, it's an important role, one that's often overstated in terms of actual U.S. leverage over Israel, right? And part of the debate, and there was an attempt, very modest attempt by the Biden team in the spring of this year to hold back delivery of certain types of weapons to try to help Israel calibrate its campaign in Rafah, and it failed abysmally because Rafah has been destroyed. But the fantasy land debate that happens here in the United States, and it happens mostly amongst policy advocacy groups and people who are still largely on the margins. If you look at the debates on universities earlier this year, at their high watermark in the spring, where they were getting a lot of attention and focus, an important thing happened on Capitol Hill. The aid to Israel, as well as aid to Ukraine and Taiwan, passed by a 4-1 margin, strong bipartisan majority support. And yes, some have made the argument that the United States should just pull back that assistance to Israel. They often make the argument while turning a blind eye to the fact that some of the same forces in Syria in particular, but Iraq, that have been attacking U.S. troops and killing U.S. troops are the ones that Israel is also targeting, and the U.S. is targeting at the same time. To simply say we're going to hold back delivery of certain assistance while Israel's got hostages held by Gaza, there's ongoing threats every day coming from multiple areas, not just Lebanon, but now increasingly Yemen and other places. And simply the notion that the United States would likely pull back that delivery of weapons while a country's being attacked by its neighbors, it doesn't really add up to more stability. In fact, in my view, the reverse is more likely, is a wider regional cataclysmic scenario. I remember in the first Gaza war, the Biden administration, a few weeks after it, some voices called for defunding the Iron Dome system, which is a defensive system that Israel uses to protect its citizens. And to me, it's something that got a vote of maybe 9 or 10 people in the House. But that idea at the time that we'd want to actually open up Israel to even greater vulnerabilities that would likely produce a bigger conflict. So I appreciate some of these proposals that essentially say, well, we should use this leverage to try to shape Israel's calculus, and especially Netanyahu and the mistakes he's made. But the reality is that any Israeli leader is going to likely respond to two main things: the security conditions his people face, and it's people that include Israeli Arabs who have been killed and kidnapped by Hamas and threatened by some of the projectiles coming from Iran and Hezbollah. Any Israeli leader is going to respond to the domestic political pressures they face, first and foremost. I think it's a bit academic because when you look at the politics of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East today, these are interesting ideas to test that they're out there in the debate, but they often don't actually answer the questions of then what? What if the war gets bigger and wider? Then what if Israel's right-wing government doesn't respond to our concerns and demands, but does the exact opposite? And that's the challenge, I think. That's where the real policy debate is. I know it's not emotionally satisfying to a lot of folks, but the outcomes, I think, would likely be even worse than what we're seeing right now.
Some might argue it can't get any worse for Gaza, and I know you're not ignoring what's happened there, of course, in your remarks. I guess I see a different.
I actually think it could get a lot worse in Gaza, and I fear for my friends who live there. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that the Biden team made, and President Biden himself, it wasn't the physical embrace of Netanyahu. It was this embrace that didn't push them towards answering the question of how does this all end in a serious, clear way. We get wrapped up in these tactical debates, but I actually worry what might come. It's been awful, 41,000 people dead, but there's a lot more people who are in a crowded area that lack sanitation. We've seen the famine problems and things like this. And we need more U.S. engagement in the region to actually prevent those worse outcomes, not less. And that's where I think essentially a lot of these ideas and arguments, whether we're talking about Israel aid or other things, amount to voices saying the United States should just unilaterally disarm itself and give up because it's just been too hard. And what I'm saying is, no, the opposite is true. We actually need to work more closely with countries like Jordan, Egypt, Gulf states, and others who want to produce the same outcomes we want: a state of Palestine and Iran that actually is not threatening. Their interests are ours.
Well, you say in your report that the actors there in the region are the most influential, most important. It seems to me that Netanyahu, the current coalition, pretty much every Israeli government, with the possible exception of the governments in the mid-1990s, have not and do not support a Palestinian state. So we talk about this as something that's a possibility. Hamas doesn't support coexistence either.
Again, going back to my thought exercise and my thinking these days, is then if you just throw up your hands and say, so what? Then in essence, those who want to restrain, and even some of these progressive forces, are essentially saying, okay, we're just going to give up. Israel can then just run roughshod over the Palestinians in the West Bank. I actually think there's an interesting window here where you've got voices in the Israeli political spectrum. They're not in the ascendancy right now, but you have voices like Yair Lapid and other circles to the center left. And the spectrum is so divided right now inside of Israel. And you saw this pre-10/7, the debates about Israel's democracy, and all of these voices that I think can coalesce around it. It's a harder case to make, certainly these days. But I actually think the shock of 10/7, the opportunity of integrating with the region, The longer term approach would require the U.S. to actually step up its engagement. Yes, use its leverage to actually shape and influence events and the discussion inside of Israel. And one of the key points of leverage that I think is underused is not this threat of military aid, which likely would be counterproductive and backfire. It's actually assembling a coalition of regional allies in the way that was not done by the George W. Bush administration. If you remember the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative from Saudi Arabia, they didn't use that, which was a unified effort. There's a new offer on the table, if you've seen statements from the leaders of Jordan and the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and others. And the Biden team has not engaged that in a way to actually, in a sense, spark a new debate inside of Israel and essentially say, you got a pathway here. You got a pathway to end this war in Gaza, to actually end what's going on in Lebanon in a way that actually produces a more stable state system. You're not going to do that by simply pulling back from the region, as some have argued, and threatening all sorts of our partners that we're not going to actually offer security assistance or other types of aid. I actually think it's a harder uphill climb, but it's a much easier case than the fantasy land proposals that are offered from different voices on the left and the right.
Well, you mentioned the West Bank. I mean, the annexation of the West Bank is already underway, de facto.
Yeah, certainly. And that's the point, is that we've got, I've mentioned this in the latest report, is that the Biden team has only done very teeny tiny tactical uses of sanctions against certain settler groups, right? But you've got ministers in this current government that have advocated an annexationist approach. And again, the U.S., I think, should engage, and that engagement to shape Israel's calculus is going to be much more powerful if we do it with Middle East partners and Arab governments in particular, who want to see Jerusalem, for instance, as a holy city that is open and has access not just to Jews, but Christians and Muslims as well. So the notion, again, why I say it's fantasy land, those who say, well, we should pull back and then just cut off aid to Israel, it doesn't, no matter who wins this election in the United States, it's not likely going to be also a scenario that's going to be supported by U.S. policy or politics, no matter who's controlling Congress or the administration.
But I see a difference in, say, supporting the Iron Dome, which is defensive, because of the very real nature of the Hezbollah presence right on the other side of the border. Hezbollah is a large and powerful organization, much more so than Hamas, has something like 150,000 rockets, is a state within a state, has seats in the Lebanese parliament. A difference between helping Israel defend itself and continuing to give it 2,000-pound bombs that are dropped on refugee camps in Beirut.
Right. So what I'm saying is, if anyone who understands how the aid delivery and defense cooperation happens, it's not like a water tap that you can turn off, right? And if you do that in such a way, every time there's been sort of debates during the ceasefire negotiations which haven't succeeded, and I've met with Houthis in my research, I've met with others, whenever they see the U.S. actually wavering in defense of itself and defense of some of its key partners, whether it's Israel or some of the Arab Gulf states, they say, aha, we need to press with more violence and more attacks because we've almost got them. And again, if you play that out over several years and this war of attrition, whether it's targeting certain Arab partners or whether it's Israel itself, the voices that essentially say, pull back, it's just a one state for now and it's going to be an apartheid state, all of it actually then doesn't add up to the very things that those people say they want for the people of Palestine or the people of Lebanon. And the thing I'd emphasize, especially in this case, and I mentioned this before, is the Biden team, it's got 3.5 months left in office, or about 3 months or so. It actually could learn a lot of lessons from many of the mistakes it's made over the last year. And a key mistake has been not to actually work with some of those Arab Middle East partners. And in places like Lebanon, for instance, I'm glad to see the Biden team and Vice President Harris highlighting humanitarian aid they want to give to the Lebanese people. They do it in such a way that it makes it sound like as if it's a hurricane or some natural disaster or earthquake that's hit. And it's a war, right? And it's a war that the United States can actually shape the outcomes on if it actually has a deeper engagement with Israel and its military leadership to define what is the end state there. And then importantly, the second pillar is you got to support the Lebanese government and the people, which includes a lot more voices than just the Hezbollah forces, which are, I think, probably weakened, that have actually hijacked the state of Lebanon. And a lot of Lebanese people hate that, including Lebanese Shia. So my formula, again, increasingly my thinking is you got to have a deeper engagement by the United States to actually make these things better. I know it goes against the grain of even some of my past work, but it's born out of like bigger disasters that emerged after I made arguments for pulling back from the Middle East.
there has to be a security component.
And it's not a versus. And this is the flaw, I think, in some of the thinking here. It's as if it's an either or. And it reminds me of, in Afghanistan, while the U.S. still had a presence there, they said, well, we should just do diplomacy. A lot of the people who proposed that we should just simply not have a military presence there, but we'll send aid workers and things like that. And that'll somehow shape and influence the outcomes there through diplomacy. And I even maybe back in 2007-8 would make those arguments. It just doesn't add up, because when some of the forces that actually are there kidnap and then kill aid workers, then you get into a pickle like we did with ISIS, which is then they provoke us and you draw them back in. That's why I think a much more measured security presence that reinforces the diplomacy is the right formula.
So about Afghanistan, you do mention it in your report, how the U.S. withdrawal did send a signal to Arab states that maybe they should start pursuing ties with China, Russia, Turkey, other outside actors, because it showed that the United States maybe wasn't all that dependable. I view the 20-year failure in Afghanistan as saying, allies are going to start questioning our sanity. The idea of credibility. It's a credibility argument. You got to stay there, because if you leave Afghanistan, you send a signal to your allies all over the world that U.S. credibility isn't worth what it has to be, right?
Where it hurt America, I think, the most are with those allies in Afghanistan that we left behind. Hundreds of thousands of people that worked with us, and we got some of them here, but not nearly enough. It also was this delusion, and to your point, I think that you're making in some of your questions, that if we just did diplomacy first with these guys, we could somehow mediate. And Trump and Pompeo were the ones who actually first crafted a deal back in 2020, which was not connected to the security dynamics on the ground. But I think when the Biden team sent Zalmay Khalilzad, who was the envoy for Trump, and then they held him over to Doha in early August to try to negotiate with the Taliban, but at a time when the Taliban were actually killing people and using force on the ground in Afghanistan, some of our partners and allies, that's a high watermark where the delusion that we can just use soft power and diplomacy that's disconnected from our security presence and shows you that that has extreme costs, first, to talk about the Afghan people, but then second, across the region. A lot of those partners that helped us get tens of thousands of Afghans out, whether it's in Qatar or other Arab Gulf states, they saw that the United States, the botched withdrawal, left an impression. And some have argued also that Putin saw that the United States could not actually competently handle some of its own security affairs, so he went forward with his second invasion of Ukraine after the first one in 2014. So again, I'm not making an argument for U.S. empire and we should stay there forever with tens of thousands of troops. What I'm saying is that the delusion that somehow, and the Biden team in this first year operated under this, that we're going to have summits for democracy and talk about human rights and democracy literally weeks after we saw the huge, massive step backwards in Afghanistan for Afghan women and other things. That does damage our credibility. The last thing I'd say is that I actually think credibility arguments and people who criticize, well, this is just about U.S. credibility, they forget also that there are security consequences of the sort that we saw with ISIS rising in Iraq and Syria after we pulled back from Iraq in 2011.
But there would be no ISIS if the United States hadn't invaded Iraq to begin with. I mean,
I don't know. That's true, because there was Al-Qaeda, which was the successor or the predecessor of that.
That's true, but there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq until the United States went in there.
Well, there wasn't, and I'm a critic of the war and also how it was handled. But the dominant strand in some quarters, and I think it's not a majority in the United States, of the sort of blame America first, if we only hadn't done this, ignores the reality that there are actually big problems out there that have emerged. And I would say one place we're not even talking, I hope you'd ask about it, is in the Horn of Africa and Sudan and Ethiopia. We actually do have a diplomacy first approach there. A guy named Tom Perriello is trying to use diplomacy, but the United States doesn't really have many security tools that it's using there. We don't talk about those places where we don't have a U.S. military presence, but where we're trying to use diplomacy. And actually, again, I used to think this way is like, okay, if we could only just send the diplomats, then the United States could somehow solve these complicated problems. And in many ways, Sudan today and Ethiopia represent a much bigger human security calamity, as well as in the longer term, a strategic calamity for that part of the world, because it's very much right up against the Red Sea and all of the problems that we see with the Houthis across the way in Yemen. But that's another, there's so many counterpoints to where the U.S. actually doesn't have a presence, but we try diplomacy, but that diplomacy ends up being empty. And it further reinforces the sense that the U.S. actually can't achieve its stated end.
Well, my position on Afghanistan was there are no good outcomes, and history didn't begin on September 11th, 2001. The United States had been involved in Afghanistan, as you know, of course, in the 1980s. In a country like that, where the U.S., after 20 years, could not defeat the Taliban, and all these problems you alluded to, treatment of women, treatment of children, etc., all these problems, we're going to stay there regardless of how long the United States stayed in the country.
Yeah, well, that period in the 1990s then produced an environment in Afghanistan that was exploited by Al-Qaeda Central and then got us drawn into the 9/11 wars. So again, that's what I'm saying is that we could point the finger and blame, and I have in my own work, but the U.S. has made so many unforced errors. But then if you draw the wrong conclusions, which is, in my view, increasingly, fatalistic, we can't do any good, America does more harm than good, maybe Iran and China and Russia can shape a better environment, or people who, again, are more realist, they brand themselves as balance of power realists or sometimes progressive, the labels are so confused these days, essentially wish away and say, okay, well, maybe the best we can do is closer to a gated community mindset, that we just need to actually have a focus closer to home. That puts you a little bit closer to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, which it's a view. And it may be one that actually we'll be living under. But what I'm saying is that essentially, I don't think that's going to produce a much more stable world. And the problems then that emerge, whether it's 9/11, ISIS, or economic security problems here at home linked to supply chain issues around the world. America shouldn't pretend to be an empire, but what I think it could do is build more stable partnerships with those around the region in the way that we've done in Europe, we've done in Asia, and the sort of chaos that we've seen in those regions of the world in previous eras, we're not witnessing in part because we actually have more stable partnerships with some of those countries, whether it's NATO allies in Europe or Japan, South Korea, Australia, increasingly India. And that's where I'm still an internationalist, because I actually think you do more harm than good than pulling back, than you get from pulling back.
I have one more question for you, but a final remark about Afghanistan. I just had Keith Mines, a former soldier, diplomat, now at the U.S. Institute of Peace on my show, and we debated Afghanistan. And, he wasn't embracing the title Forever War, but his argument was, listen, the fact is there are insurgent forces fighting central governments all over the world, and that the United States had an interest in staying in Afghanistan. Sure, you can call it forever war, but it would have prevented a Taliban takeover at what he called a relatively low cost. The United States stays there, prevents a Taliban from taking over, and continues to work on real nation building rather than what has happened since the withdrawal. So his counter-argument to my call to get out of Afghanistan was, there are also unintended consequences to doing it my way as well.
Yeah. No, that's what I'm trying to say. And it's a good exchange here. Beneath the level of endless wars and the sloganeering of forever wars, I used to use slogans myself in my work. And it's fine to get sort of emotional and psychological comfort from these sorts of things. But actually, when you do the job as an analyst, and that's what I see my job as at a think tank, is then think things through in terms of the consequences or some of the things I proposed in the past and try to learn from those mistakes. And I think a much more balanced approach that it is what it is today. 2024 Afghanistan, we're not there, right? And it's largely out of sight, out of mind. But I hope I'm wrong, but I think perhaps just for now, right? And this is the sort of thing where places like Pakistan, where we operated under so many delusions and used drone strikes and tried to triple non-military assistance to Pakistan, there's so many lessons learned from the last 20, 25 years in places where we didn't really have a substantial U.S. troop presence. And I cited also what's going on in East Africa and the Horn of Africa these days. We can let others shape dynamics, or we can, as we've largely been, as I argue in this strategic drift report on the Middle East, largely reactive to events and crisis management and tear ourselves up in partisan and ideological debates at home about Israel and Palestine and Iran. Or we could actually try to come up with some solutions that are a bit more balanced and learn the lessons from the mistakes made by U.S. unforced errors, learn the mistakes, as Keith sounds like he's saying, from actually not thinking through the consequences of quicker pullbacks and what are also sort of middle solutions there.
Speaking of slogans and cliches, it is a cliche to say we're living through a hinge point or a turning point or a watershed moment in history. I think in the history of the modern Middle East, this past year has certainly been one of those. So I don't think that's a cliche. However, it's hard to know where it's going, where this is going to end. And, you hear this term, the new Middle East. We started talking about Jake Sullivan, who seemed to imply that the region was on the brink of a new era in relations, a new era in the U.S. role. Biden could achieve what so many other U.S. presidents wanted to achieve, and that was to have a lesser footprint in the Middle East so the U.S. could focus on other parts of the world. Well, here we are a year later. That has not turned out to be the case. What do you think when you hear those words, new Middle East? Are we on the verge of a new Middle East if and when this war ends?
Well, it really depends on, first, as I mentioned, the drivers of events in the Middle East, which is what their calculus is and who remains. I mean, Israel and Hamas has been engaged in a vicious war for the last year, and Hamas is diminished, but it's not out, right? And it's still a factor there. Hezbollah, you could probably play that out, as you were indicating in your questions, that Hezbollah, some elements of its leadership are gone. I mean, they're eliminated, but then other elements will still remain. And same thing with Iran. Nothing static. Iran is facing a lot of pressures from within, from its own people. The pressures related to its presence in the region. So people of Iran really disenchanted with the fact that you've got a regime that's invested so much money in its forward presence, and they don't see it as protecting them. Yeah. They see it as reinforcing the autocratic authoritarianism of that regime.
And the Lebanese are unhappy with Hezbollah, but now that their country's been invaded, there's a rally around the flag effect possibly. But go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, kind of, sort of. I mean, I talk to people in Lebanon every day, as I do regularly with Palestinian friends in Gaza. And it's not black and white, right? A lot of people still hold a finger of blame towards those actors for actually focusing on things that I think get glorified from the distance of 7,000 miles as resistance and all of this other stuff. And actually the world is a lot more complicated.
I agree. Hezbollah achieved nothing by firing rockets into Israel the day after October 7.
And continue to do so, and then killing those poor Druze children on the Golan Heights. And that was a key marker in all of this. I guess what I would say is that those visions, which I've been critical of the Biden team for having, in part because they didn't actually keep an eye also on the harsh realities of the Middle East today. I actually think you don't want to discard those visions, because people of the region actually want hope. They want to actually have a better future where their dignity is supported, their prosperity, their security. And we can't provide that. Certainly, we've learned that. But what I'm saying essentially, and there's a core point here, is that if the U.S. works in partnership, as we've done in Europe and in Asia, with some of these partners, and some of them are very flawed, but you try to shape and influence their actions, you actually may produce a longer, sort of more prosperous Middle East in the long run. You're not going to get there in the short run, but the key thing is not to pull back. It's actually to more deeply engage, to use diplomacy first, but it's a diplomacy that isn't empty and naive and sticks its head in the sand about the threats that are out there, but one that actually works to use our military role, but also our security partnership engagement that lifts up the people of the region. It's probably a better formula. It's one that the Iraqis, when I went into Iraq in 2003, they were glad that Saddam Hussein was gone, but then couldn't fathom why we actually screwed up so badly in not helping secure the country. My lesson from that is that actually you need to invest more in U.S. diplomatic economic engagement, but have it backed up by that security role that we have, rather than rip off the Band-Aid and say, this has just been too frustrating and hard.
We thank Brian Katulis of the Middle East Institute for his insights, and I will share links to his reports in my weekly newsletter. And I would like to thank all of you for listening to this podcast over the past 4 years. We launched History as It Happens in January 2021, just as President Biden was being inaugurated, shortly after the January 6 mob attack on the U.S. Capitol. We felt like we were living through a historic moment, the first time we did not have a peaceful transfer of power in this country. I can say we're living through another historic moment today, with wars in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and another U.S. election coming up. And I hope to have History as It Happens in a new home soon.
Okay, it's official. We are very much in the final sprint to Election Day. And face it, between debates, polling releases, even court appearances, it can feel exhausting, even impossible to keep up with. I'm Brad Milkey. I'm the host of Start Here, the daily podcast from ABC News. And every morning, my team and I get you caught up on the day's news in a quick, straightforward way that's easy to understand, with just enough context so you can listen, get it, and go on with your day. So, kickstart your morning. Start smart with Start Here and ABC News, because staying informed shouldn't feel overwhelming.